Hi, Dinosaur Bob here. In the earlier installments of this series, we first learned about how the creator of worlds came out of the void and gathered together the energies and forces and matter to create the world of Cartyrion. And then he pretty much took a look at it, said, yeah, okay, great. And he moved on to do what he does, which is create other physical worlds. In the last installment, we learned about how the people who came after him, or more particularly the Astralar, the celestial and/or um, other outer plane races, came after him, and those are the ones that are going to actually stick around and be responsible for the real creation of life and everything, activity and everything else on Cartyrion. And in fact, we heard the creation stories for the six major player races that we'll be dealing with in our game world. Today, we're going to actually take that information and we're going to go back to the maps and we're going to start taking a look at exactly what Cartyrion looked like as it was being populated, and more importantly, what it looks like at the time point that we're going to call today, the time point, at which we'll actually start looking at detailed areas of the world and building adventures and really fleshing out the world to make it a good um, RPG gaming environment. So let's get started. First thing we need to do is take a look again at the worlds that um, were left by the creator of worlds. And you guys have seen these maps before. These are the two hemisphere maps, that were used in the earlier videos. And they're pretty good. They give a good representation of what the world looks like from space. But unfortunately, they're not the best maps in the world for actually laying out, the foliage and population centers and that sort of thing. Mainly because you really only get to see the center areas pretty well. And in fact, as I looked around this world, I realized that there was actually a pretty interesting continental area that I want to deal with that actually happens to be out at the edges of these two maps. And it would be pretty near impossible to do any kind of meaningful manipulation of those areas. So the first thing I had to do was find a map projection that would, first of all, let me see the entire world in one sheet, and second of all, let me focus on the areas that are going to be most interesting. And Fractal Terrains, which is the product that created this world in the first place, is fortunately filled with a whole bunch of potential map projections. And in fact, by the way, I'm going to put a little poll up in the cards here. If anybody is interested in me putting together a little mini video, a little tutorial video on Fractal Terrains itself, on that product and how I use it, I'd be happy to do that. But again, in moving around and looking around, this is the projection that I ended up settling on. And what you're looking at now is the entire world. Kind of picture it as a globe whose skin has been kind of unfolded from the back to the front. So you're looking at a center point in the middle of the map. The extreme left and right edges of the map um, join up. They're actually the same physical point. You can see land masses go off on one end and come back on the other. Just to make it clear what you're looking at, the two red stars that you see on the map right now, those two stars are actually 180 degrees apart. If you were to drill straight down from one of them, you would go through the core of the Earth, or I should say the core of Cartyrion, and you would come out at the other one. So we need to keep that in mind. But you'll notice that actually what was on the left side before is now on the right. What was on the right side is now on the left. And that's because the best way for me to center on that interesting landmass, the one that was on the edges of the original maps, it was for me to actually center on literally center on that edge. And now that interesting area is the area that you see right in the middle, just north of the equator on the map. So now let me get rid of the stars. And what we're looking at now is the world as the creator of worlds left it. I've also recolored this a little bit, and that's because what we're about to start doing is putting in some yellows and greens and things like that to represent the various levels of foliage and deserts and all that kind of good stuff. And the green, the default green that was on the earlier maps, really wasn't an indication of foliage. It was an indication of altitude, believe it or not. But that was the default sets from Fractal Terrain. So I went in and recolored some things just so that we know what we're working with. Obviously, the blue is water. All of the shades of gray are land masses. So this is the point where we're going to be working. You'll remember from the stories that the creator of worlds did create deserts. And when Berdea of the Olivar first started the greening of the world, he chose to leave some areas alone. The areas he left alone were the high mountains and the deserts. So the first thing I needed to do was figure out where to put the deserts. And so I did. All right, and here are the three major desert areas. Now, just a little caveat, and this is going to extend to all of the things that we're doing today. This doesn't necessarily mean these are the only areas on the entire planet that are deserts, but it's the three areas that are big enough for us to consider as major land features right now. There could very well be smaller desert areas that we create as we go along. Now, the other area that was created by, or that was left alone, I should say, by Berdea, were the high mountain areas. And those are the areas that are represented on this map by the darker shades of gray going to black. We're also going to leave those pretty much uncolored as we go along. That's not to say that there won't be any trees in the places that end up being gray. It just means that they're, if they exist at all, they're very sparse and not, not significant enough to be shown as major foresting areas. The one other thing that we're going to kind of leave out of the greening of the world is the areas at the extreme north and south of the planet. The areas where ice and snow will fall pretty much all year long and would cover over any green that was there. So let's lay the iced over areas into the map now. And again, if you look at the one at the top at the North Pole especially, you'll see I left the mountain areas still gray. That's because I didn't want to bury the mountains with this mapping. But the lower lying areas that anywhere else on the planet might possibly be green, the things that you see in white now are the things that we can expect will constantly be ice and snow covered. And obviously we have a lot of opportunity for setting up adventures there. So this is the area, what you see left is the area that Berdea had to work with. And let's start by putting down the big forests, the big forest areas that we envision for the world. And if we do that, and we're going to see there's a lot of them, these are the areas that to this day we expect are still dense, essentially, I don't like using the word unexplored because there's certainly plenty of things living in these forests. But they're not settled. You won't find towns and villages. You won't find farms interspersed in these areas, or at least not for the most part. Surrounding the farms, or surrounding the forests, I should say, are the other green areas. And these are the areas, there may still be some small forested areas here, some little copses of woods and glens and things like that. But in addition to those, these are also the areas, the grasslands, the plains, the low-lying areas, the fertile areas near the seas and the rivers, all that sort of thing. And you pretty much have a good idea of what we're talking about there. The last the last greening areas that I'm going to throw into the map are the major swamp areas or marsh areas. And again, these aren't the only swamps in the world, but these are the really big ones. These are the ones that we can generate, whole adventures and tales and lore around. You'll notice especially the one to the far left of the map in the upper hemisphere that actually separates a major landmass into two sections. So that if there happened to be populations living on one that wanted to migrate to the other, they have several hundred miles, if not 1,000 miles or more of swamp to go through in order to get where they're going. So this is the result of Berdea's efforts at putting the plant life and the green and living things on the world. The stories also told us that Berdea filled all these areas with the various insects and animals and birds and reptiles, we can assume, and fish and amphibians, and all of the common animals we're talking about here that you'd expect to find in an adventure world. Um, you'll also recall that Berdea's mate Adazana populated pretty much all of these areas with various forms of fey life, the pixies and sprites and the various kinds of nymphs, the forest nymphs and the plains nymphs and the mountain nymphs and the river nymphs and the sea nymphs. They're all living in these worlds. But this is the world that Berdea looked down on when he finally decided that he needed something more. And the first thing that he decided, as you'll recall, was to awaken a race that we will now call the elves. So the next thing we're going to do is take a look at this map and decide where exactly we're going to place the area where the elves first awakened, the area that's now called Elvenhome. So, where are we going to put Elvenhome? Well, looking at the map, there's one spot that's got lots of forest, lots of green. It's in a broad valley in the middle of two large mountain ranges. There's a beautiful large lake area there. So I think that's the spot we're going to put it. And that spot is right here. And if you notice, there's a few forest centers there. The little one in the center, that will be the core of Elvenhome. The elves will be expanding their populations from that point. Okay, so now, where do we put the first dwarves? Well, let's assume that Garanon was smart and he didn't want to put his dwarves right on top of the elves. That would have only caused trouble. So let's assume that he went kind of as far away as he could. But the story also tells us he was looking for the tallest mountain, the mightiest mountain, and it turns out that the tallest and mightiest mountain happens to be just about half a world away. So that's where we're going to call the first home of the dwarves, and that's this mountain complex over here. You'll also recall that not only the dwarves, but the gnomes will call that their first home as well. So we've got our elven first home and our dwarven first home. And for 1,000 years, they were the only two major races on the planet. And the elves had an extra 1,000 years head start on top of that. Then along came the goblins, and the goblin taleteller told us that the goblins were placed anywhere and everywhere there were elves and dwarves. So before we can place the goblins, we have to ask ourselves, in 2,000 years for the elves and 1,000 years for the dwarves, how far have they expanded? And this is what we're going to come up with for that. And you'll notice I've got little blue X's denoting the areas where the elves will be more or less concentrated. That's a interesting word for the elves. There might be elven cities, but it's more like elven settlements. You'll notice that not all of them are in forests. All right, there are some areas where the free elves may have congregated a little bit. You'll notice there's one or at least one up in the snowy areas, so we have the snow elves starting to form. The red circles, they're easy to spot for dwarves. They are all located on major mountains. So basically the dwarves have been moving from mountain range to mountain range. and expanding themselves out that way. You will also notice, though, down toward the bottom left, there's one of them across a large body of water. That tells us that the seafarer dwarves may have already gotten a start this early. But in any sense, if this is where the elves and the dwarves are, it's safe to say that this is where the first goblins were. They're everywhere. They're in little pockets everywhere, but they're everywhere. That fits the stories, and it also kind of fits the nature of goblins. All right, we're going to find goblins anywhere on the planet that we go. So now let's move on to humans, and then shortly after the humans, the halflings. Well, when Prominion came along, he again his idea of a good race were people that would be ambitious. So unlike the goblins that were spread all over the planet, Prominion figured, I'm going to put them all in kind of one place to start, and see how well they do at spreading out and expanding and broadening their control over the world and that sort of thing. For the same reason, he kind of tried to keep them a little bit away from the dwarves and gnomes and elves, at least initially, although the dwarves and gnomes had spread out. He, again, didn't want to cramp in on their homelands. So we're going to assume that Prominion picked this region to plant the first humans. All right, and those humans 16,000 years ago awoke, and they were kind of scattered around this large sea here, around the shores. And from there, they learned to work both the sea and the land. They started doing what humans do, which is gather into villages and towns and then cities. All right, so and they would have expanded out from these points as well. So that brings the question now, after 16,000 years of humans being on the planet, what does Cartyrion look like now? And here's what we're going to go with for that. All right, you see, we got lots of little symbols here. All right, as before, the little blue X's, those are the elven concentrations. The red circles are the dwarven concentrations. By the way, there might be one or two of those dwarven concentrations that aren't quite in the main mountains. That's because we've got hill dwarves to deal with. And the black crosses or plus signs are human major settlements. Now you'll notice the humans have kind of kept along the coasts. All right, they've used the seas, and they've used the seas to spread all over Cartyrion. They're not exclusively in the seas. There are one or two spots where they're inland. And again, these are just the major cities. All right. We are not going to try to identify, at least right now, we're not going to name every one of these major cities. But for the future, this is what we're going to have to work with. In between those cities, there are countless human towns and villages. We'll have pretty much free reign to decide exactly what kind of human settlements we want. So the bottom line is we've got, and I should mention, of course, that the goblins, they're everywhere. All right, we're not showing them on this map, but you can be pretty rest assured that wherever there's a symbol on this map for humans, dwarves, gnomes, or halflings or elves, there's goblins there too. So that's basically it for laying out the maps. We've placed the terrain, we've placed the populations, and now we'll get to move forward from there. So what are our next steps going to be? Well, we've got a couple of choices, and I'm going to ask you in the comments to tell me which direction you would like to see me head in next. We can start zeroing in on more detailed areas of the maps. And in particular, I mean, I've got an idea for a first area for low-level adventures. I have a pretty good idea of where to place it on the map. We can proceed directly with that. That will also require that we explain some other human kingdoms and maybe give a name or two to a dwarven settlement and an elven settlement. So we can take that approach and kind of get ourselves set up to actually start mapping out our first adventures. Or we can go back to the player races and start to hash out what makes our player races, and in particular our sub races, unique in the world of Cartyrion. We're going to have to do both eventually. So as I said, I'm going to leave it up to you folks in the comments to kind of give me an idea of which direction to go. As I'm recording this video, it's about a week before Christmas. I'm trying to get a video out once a week. I can't promise that the next one is going to be a week from now, since Christmas is in the way, and of course there's family obligations and so forth. But I will do my best. And in the meantime, I hope you will continue to keep up with the work I've been doing here, and get as many of your friends, please, to subscribe as possible. So that's going to be it for today. As usual, I have to end with please give me a thumbs up before you go. And if you haven't subscribed already to the channel, please subscribe. And until next time, may the dice be with you.